within a few days. Um, so today we're continuing in a series about Tier 2. This one is talking about specifically the problem-solving process as it's applied to Tier 2. Because this is a series, there are topics that will overlap with other episodes from this series. And so where that happens, we'll refer you to additional resources to dig into those topics. We'll probably instead just give it lip service here so that we can make time for new information that perhaps hasn't already been addressed in the series. Um, Let us also just check and make sure that technology is working. For those of you online now, you'll see that you have access to raising a hand. If folks could just raise their little hand and let me know that you can hear me okay. All right, so we got folks raising their hand. Fantastic. All right, wonderful. Great, thank you all for doing that. If for any reason you find any technical issues happening for yourself along the way, please feel free to type into the chat pod. Therese is sitting here next to me, and she'll be able to respond to any issues that come up for you during the presentation. Um, with regards to the file pod share, there are a number of documents that we've posted here for you. Feel free to start downloading those now and make those accessible on your computer, or if you have access to a printer now, you can print them. These are documents that we'll highlight along the way. Some best suited, I think, for those of you who are at that district level and who are providing coaching supports to schools or to school teams. But that doesn't mean that our teacher colleagues and our school-based staff couldn't benefit from having access to this information. I will, though, clarify two different sort of users, if you will, more of the novice problem solver and more of the expert problem solver. And so we'll get into that a little bit later. But for now, again, using that hand raising feature, could I just get a sense of who among you has had previous training either by the PBIS project or perhaps our colleagues in the RTI project on this process of problem solving? So anybody with previous knowledge or experience with this process? Great. Okay. Thank you so much for that. For those of you who did not raise a hand, I will assume goodwill and make the assumption then that perhaps this is a new topic for you. And so if you do have questions along the way, please feel free to let us know, and we will stop as necessary to answer the questions that you have. We'll also provide an opportunity at the end to answer any questions that you have for us. So just a quick overview. We're going to make sure that we highlight a structured four-step problem-solving process as it applies to Tier 2. And in particular, we're going to look at specific variables that you might want to consider when thinking about facilitating this process at Tier 2. So the application here will be school-based. Our focus here is on problem-solving for academic, instructional, behavioral kinds of issues at that student-focused level. If you are interested in problem solving for organizational or implementation change types of things, please let us know by email, and we'd be happy to assist you in accessing content about that focus. But for today, we're just going to keep it specifically on students and primarily about behavior. I think this satisfies our contractual obligation to show you a triangle. And having done that, again, I think for many of you, you already know about the importance of Tier 1. But it deserves mentioning here that when we think about giving students interventions, whether we're talking Tier 2 or Tier 3, we have to remember kind of the end game here that we're trying to get to. So I would ask that all of you throughout this entire presentation do not forget the purpose of Tier 2 is twofold. One, it's to prevent students from requiring more intensive services at Tier 3. If we don't satisfy that objective or that purpose for Tier 2, then there's really no value to Tier 2. It's just a flow through where every kid who stops here at Tier 2 just eventually gets Tier 3 anyway. The purpose of Tier 2 is in the first part to prevent kids from needing more intensive services, because if we catch them early enough, provide matched intervention services, that should be sufficient to prevent the problem from getting worse. The other purpose of Tier 2 is to help kids perform at a level expected at Tier 1 and without requiring the additional supports to do that. Now, that option isn't so much of a stickler. There are going to be cases where some students who, when you get them to perform at a Tier 1 level, their outcomes are no different than other students that are performing well, and you remove these Tier 2 supports, they drop back into the problem that's at hand. And in those situations, we put those supports back in place, and we find that many students, perhaps, they just need to always have that constant little bit of extra support in order to make their grade level or behavioral expectations year to year. And that's okay. That is absolutely okay. But we want to make sure that we clarify that up front, just so that we don't lose sight of it as we talk about Tier 2 here. Okay. As a general overview, and as a resource, if you're not already familiar with it, on the Department of Education, the Florida DOE's website for multi-tiered systems of support, you will find access to the guiding tools for instructional problem solving. This was a resource developed primarily led by the Student Services Project and in collaboration with stakeholders throughout the state. And what it does is it defines the problem-solving process and the best practices associated with making decisions around what's going to work for kids and who should get what, when, where, why. So if you're not already familiar with that resource, I would recommend that you take a look at it. We've recently revised it to be more in line with advances in the way that our system operates in Florida, and also to just sort of update and clean up language and other kinds of nuances. If you have questions about it, please contact any of our staff in our PBIS project, and we'd be happy to also share more information about its use. But for the purposes of here, again, just making sure that we're all on the same page, that when we're talking about problem solving for student-focused concerns, we are referring to 4 basic steps. But again, I mentioned that there's sort of a novice learner and an advanced learner that we're trying to build this webinar for here. So if you're somebody for whom this problem-solving topic is relatively new, I want you to know that this is definitely an appropriate webinar for you, but that there are other webinar devices or content or tools that we can provide you to also give you additional information. As well as, I think it's through our Fiddlers partner out of the Professional Development Resource Network online, I think we also have a module on kind of introductory multi-tiered systems in which this problem-solving component is also addressed for an introductory purpose. But when it comes to sort of separating out what amount of training do I need to help staff at the school level have in order to functionally operate as a team to make decisions for kids that are going to work, there are a couple of ways that we want to do that. For one, at the very least, for our novice staff members, let's just make sure they have a basic understanding of the process. Let's make sure that they have specific materials and tools that help them to understand what process to follow, and that the members of that team have very specific roles and responsibilities so that they understand the flow of conversation for that team. We want to have advanced agendas. If there's data that's going to be reviewed, let's have access to it before the meeting. Let's make sure this facilitator sets the tone for the accomplishments that we'll try to achieve for that specific meeting, whether it's part of the process or the whole process. And then let's also make sure that that facilitator recognizes the different contributions that each member can contribute along the way and help to get those folks to share their input and expertise. And this includes family members as well. For the advanced learner, I want to highlight a couple of handouts that we have for you. One of those has to do with the problem-solving model crosswalk, if you will. And in that document, it's just basically showing you that when it comes to problem solving, there are different models for it. There are lots of different ways to look at problem solving, and it just really comes down to asking the same basic 4 questions that we have here on the screen now. You know, what is the problem to be addressed? What are some possible reasons why that problem is existing? What are the interventions, or what are we going to do about it? And then, do we know if our plan is working? Is the problem getting reduced? Is it getting better? And so no matter what problem-solving model you may be familiar with or using, the most important thing that we have found in our work on this is it's less important which specific model of problem solving you are using as much as it's making sure that everybody in your building is using the same one. If you have 5 members on a team coming together to work through a problem solving situation at Tier 2, and each of those people has a completely different and perhaps implicit idea of what problem solving is, they're going to have a hard time coming to agreement on what to do about the problem. They're going to have a hard time agreeing on when to look at specific types of data, what to look for in that data, what data to select and not worry about looking at yet at this point. You could run the risk of having what I refer to as data chaos, and people just get completely overwhelmed, and then what ends up happening is the problem-solving process gets blamed as opposed to the foundations that were needed to make it work. So that's, again, just a little bit more advanced understanding of this problem solving. It's only as effective as that team foundation and common language, common understanding that you've established. Another tool that's in here is, again, more of that advanced problem solving, is thinking about problem solving across the different tiers. In their document pod handout, there's a handout called Summary of Problem Solving at each tier. So again, in general, we're asking the same basic 4 questions of problem solving. But at Tier 1, the scope is going to be larger. It's going to be focusing more on issues of why are so many kids demonstrating a similar problem? What is the systemic reason for that? Is it the fidelity of our instruction? Is it the fidelity of our PBIS model? Is it some other larger systemic issue that's distracting or preventing kids from reaching their grade level or behavioral goals? Where then when we get into tiers 2 and 3, it does become much more now student focused. It does become more an aspect of what is it about the learner that we also have to take into consideration. And so we're going to address some of those hypotheses or domains that you might consider along the way here in this presentation. So starting now with problem identification, the very first step of the process. For behavior, let's start with recognizing that there are different sources of data that we can start to take a look at. Because the question here is how do we identify a student who might need Tier 2? And there really isn't one way to do that. The 2 most common or perhaps probable ways that you might have experienced is when a school-based leadership team is working with grade level teachers at a PLC level, and they're looking at Tier 1 data, and they're identifying that maybe their core is healthy, maybe it's not healthy, and there's some things to improve, but there's a group of students who clearly need something a little bit more. And then they start to have a conversation about what is it that those extra students, those few students or those groups of students might need. So we can identify kids for Tier 2 based on what we see in our Tier 1 data. Another way to find those students is through nomination, if you will. Sometimes students at the high school level will self-select, going to a guidance counselor or a dean and sharing confidential information about a need that they have and that they need help to address this. It could be parents who say, you know what, I need to let you know, for my kid, my wife and I, we just recently decided we're going to get a divorce. Our house is going through some chaos right now, and I don't know what impact it's going to have on my son or daughter, but I wanted somebody at the school to be aware of this. Teachers themselves could make nominations about, well, I'm seeing that the student is sort of shutting down. Yes, they don't have ODRs in the school. We don't see any explosive kinds of external behaviors, but I'm just noticing this sort of concern with their mental health and or social emotional performance or participation. So any number of these options here could get us to thinking about Tier 2 access. And then the final one that I really want to emphasize is don't forget about academic data. And in particular, I want to go back again to students who perhaps have more internalizing kinds of concerns when it comes to behavior. Students who are just having academic failure after academic failure, maybe even chronically over the years now that they're in middle school or high school. And these are students for whom we start to see social relationships are limited, very little eye contact in the classroom, not participating, shutting down, attendance concerns. These are things that really should start to kind of play out for us as to something that we want to address early. Again, don't rely just on ODRs to find these students at Tier 2. There are some resources that we have here in the chat pod. I'm going to ask Therese just to make sure that we identify them correctly. One is the teacher nomination form.
That's right.
There's also a screening tool matrix for you here in the download pod. And then I think the other one was the grade level team identification form. So I don't know, Teresa, if you just want to highlight each of those or just generally what those can do.
Absolutely. For schools that are going through our Tier 2 training or would like to go through our Tier 2 training, we do spend some time talking about the importance of having screening measures and using multiple measures to identify students who might have some additional social, emotional, or behavioral needs. So the screening tool matrix does a nice job of outlining a few of the commonly available screening tools. Some of them are for purchase, some of them are not. They may be free. And then we also offer from the PBS project the teacher nomination form and the grade level team identification form, which are basically the same sort of screening tool. It's just one is completed by individual teachers and the other is completed by a grade level team. So you have probably fewer students being nominated overall when the grade level team sits down to identify their top 6 or so students that they think need some additional support versus if you had every teacher in your school complete that same form. But those are nice resources because they prompt teachers to think about internalizing signs of need as well as externalizing signs of need. So it's not just focused on kids who are being sent down to the office, it's also the kids sitting quietly in the back of the room that aren't engaged.
Mhm. Great. So just a question out to the audience then, if you would be willing to share with us through the chat pod, are there other sources of data that you know your schools are using that they have found helpful in identifying students that might benefit from Tier 2? So normally my wait time would extend much longer because I have no problem waiting. But since we're on a webinar, I'm going to assume then that perhaps we've covered the gamut here. Moving on, here's just an example of that teacher nomination form that Therese was giving us a rundown about. If you have questions about using this or implementing it for use in any of your schools, please contact any one of the folks here on our staff or perhaps the PBS member that's assigned to your district or or again, anybody else can help you with that. Uh, I noticed Brandy Polk was in the early stages of universal screeners, yes. And I know that in some of our schools in Polk County, I think there's 3 schools in Polk County that right now are going through the AWARE project. I think they're starting to pilot the use of universal screeners. A couple of points of conversation there that you might consider as you talk to your schools about the adoption of this. One thing that I would consider is on the use of universal screeners, just in case anybody's not familiar with this is the idea that let's put out sort of a thermometer test purpose and get a sample of information from students or teachers and to see if there are early signs of an issue that hasn't yet really come to the point of a crisis, but that would certainly be something to address early on. And so these are things like we could provide a survey out to students on a variety of mental health concerns, asking them about symptoms of anxiety or depression or quality or school culture and climate. Any of these could be tools and resources that we could certainly implement. A couple of things, though, have to be considered, in my opinion. One is don't screen for things that you don't have ways to address or you don't have resources to address. So if we start screening for a whole lot of students for depression, and we find that a large percentage of our kids are indicating, you know what, they've got risks for depression, and we have absolutely no Tier 2, Tier 3 resources to address this, it really is going to become overwhelming. Now, that doesn't mean let's not try to find these kids, but it just means that when we plan to use a screener, we should also plan to have intervention options for what we're screening for at the same time. The other thing I would consider too with universal screeners is, on the one hand, you could look at just right off the bat giving everybody a universal screener at the beginning of a year, let's say it's like school climate, school culture. But on issues of mental health, perhaps you could take more of a gated approach where our early signs are going to be like the early warning indicators or ODRs or teacher nominations, academic performance. And if we don't see anything there, then maybe there isn't a need for universal screening up front. But if we do and we suspect that there are some internalizing issues, then we can follow up with an additional screener to confirm that hypothesis. So any of those, I think, are probably good conversations to have.
I would throw in there too, because we know from research that there are a lot of kids out there that do have mental health needs. So another option is to use those screeners. And then if you do have a large number of students identified for a particular need that maybe you don't have a specific tier 2 program for, you can also look at ways of incorporating the same principles of intervention into your tier 1 program or your tier 1 curricula. So for example, if you have a lot of students who score high on depression, then you can start to incorporate aspects of positive psychology like gratitude journaling into your tier 1 curricula. So if you're concerned that you might not have that specific tier 2 program already in place, what I would do is just work with your district personnel who have some familiarity with tier 2 interventions and find out what are the needs of your students, and then depending how big those needs are, look at tier 1 or tier 2.
That's a great idea. Um, all right, so again, working with problem identification here, this is where, for many of you, again, familiar with this process, but even if you're not, if you're familiar with the idea of why we have SMART goals, I mean, if you're familiar with developing IEPs or school improvement plans, any kind of action plan, we want to have a SMART goal because at the end, we want to make sure that the issue we're addressing is well understood by our team members to the point where every one of us has our perceptions in the right place of what we're looking for and what does not constitute as part of this problem. So if we don't define the problem well, we could all walk away from the table as a team looking for something different. And because we see something different, we're going to have different expectations about what we are expecting to change, and or we might have different ways to measure that. And then what ends up happening, if you think it down kind of down the road when we get to the point of deciding, is our plan working and what should we do next for this student, we're going to have a hard time agreeing on whether this plan worked because we didn't agree really on what the goal is or what the problem was. So right off the bat, we definitely want to make sure that we are very clear on what that problem is. It needs to be specific, measurable, observable. We can certainly look at long-term goals and short-term goals. But when we're developing goals for Tier 2, I want to just go back and emphasize again that connection with Tier 1. The most distant or primary goal of Tier 2 really should be the performance indicator that got that student on our radar in the first place at Tier 1. If they have crossed a threshold with our Tier 1 data that got them onto our radar to give Tier 2, then our ultimate goal is to get them to the point where they're performing back in line with that Tier 1 data source. The Tier 2 goal itself, though, may be then more in relation to the hypothesis. If the student is coming to us for Tier 2 for literacy concerns, they're not performing well in their comprehension tests, we find out that they do not have early literacy skills, and that's the barrier to their performance at Tier 1, then clearly Tier 2 is going to be the goal of building those early literacy skills for the purpose of improving at that Tier 1. And we'll have progress monitoring data to look at more kinds of intermittent goal setting on those early literacy skills. So we're going to balance that out here as we get into our measurement approach to this process. So we have our goal, and so here are some examples and non-examples that you might consider. On the non-example side, a problem statement like, students are not compliant and they're disruptive. So first of all, we're taking on two different behaviors here. We might want to consolidate that into one class of behaviors if we can. If they're serving the same purpose or function, we could just basically bring that into one class of behavior. But a better example would be we state the condition in which this is happening, the specific behavior that's occurring in observable ways, and the purpose that it serves that student. So when asked to engage in classwork in their classrooms, the students engage in disruptive behaviors to avoid completing classwork. So having those three components is really going to set us up for engineering the right plan that matches that student situation and the right context, and gives us a way to measure that more effectively too. On a goal statement side, we could say, all right, well, we want these students to follow teacher directions. Well, but again, if we leave it at that, we're going to all have different ideas about what we're looking for if we want to go observe the student performing, compliance with teacher directions. Does that student have to do it within 5 seconds to count as a following direction? Does the student have to initiate it real quickly, or does it just matter if they complete it? These are those little, getting in the weed kind of conversations that we have to have in order to get to a healthy goal statement. But it also doesn't have a criteria. So let's look at the good example. By the end of the second semester, so there's the terminal deadline or the timeline, students will complete at least 80% of all classwork assigned across all classes. And so now we have a measurable goal. We can, at the end of the second semester, we can look at the percentage of classwork that has been turned in. Now notice that goal is not talking about the performance on that classwork. They could get all Fs. So as a team, you have to ask, are you okay with that? Do we just want to take on completing it first and worry on quality later? Or do we want to try to address both up front? So these are conversations that help make sure that we're going to focus on the right plan. So we have a poll question for you. I'd like to bring that up here in just a minute. So if you would, let's just take a moment to practice this. Here are 4 different types of statements, and we'd like you to read them and choose for us which one you think is the most appropriate problem ID statement for Tier 2.
Right, we see the answers starting to come in. Once you've read your selections, you can make your choice by clicking in the circle next to the problem ID statement that you think makes the best problem ID statement for Tier 2. All right, so now you can see what everyone else said.
All right, so yeah, and I'll say that there are some tricky issues here, I think, that we can start talking about real quickly. With regards to the first one, I think we're on the right track. I mean, we've got this kind of approximately 1/3 statement in there. We're referring to specifically 10th graders, and we're referring to the fact that they have more than one referral for aggression. One of the things that we could do to improve that statement is really go beyond just a generic close to 1/3 type phrase. I mean, let's really spell out the specific percentage of students. Do we have 33% of students, or is it 35, 40? Let's be very, very specific about that percentage, because when it comes time to evaluate the success of our plan, if we went from 33% to 30%, that's one piece of information. But if we keep it general to, approximately 1/3, and we've moved from 33 to 30, we're still basically approximately 1/3. And so the more specific we are, the better progress we can measure. The last one is clearly a better response. We have the conditions in which something's occurring. You'll notice it's really more of a tier 1 kind of a focus here, but yet we can certainly look at specifics here. We're looking at 5 office referrals already this year across 75 students, the majority of which are tardiness and truancy. And then we can see that there are students identified by teachers as slowly showing difficulty with organization. About a quarter of these students were identified as having high levels of internalizing symptoms. So all of these are providing us a much more specific, measurable, observable amount of information that we can start to think about now. Why is that happening? All right, great. Thank you for participating in that. We'll hide that. Fantastic. All right. I'm just going to, for the sake of time, go past that. Let's move in now to identifying why the problem exists. So again, thinking here, there are really lots of different ways we could approach this. And as a resource in the chat box, the file pod, I want to refer you to a handout in there called Hypothesis Domains. And so if you haven't already downloaded that, I would recommend that you do that. We're going to talk about it on this slide and the next slide. I want you all, my my ultimate professional learning goal for all of you and all of your colleagues is we don't want to get hung up on name brand problem solving. There are so many different models of problem solving out there. There are so many different frameworks for analyzing and understanding why problems exist. These are just four that I have put up here on this screen because they're very common in the literature. But each of them has a lot of similarity. It's just sometimes you're going to find nuances in vocabulary and emphasis and priority. But what certainly I want you to think about is if you're in a coaching role in your district and you're helping school teams to learn how to do this process, again, think about the novice learner, think about the educators sitting around in a PLC or a problem-solving team at the school level. And they themselves may not have the content knowledge that you do or that student services does or any other individuals who have a larger background in, say, psychology, counseling, mental health, etc. But how do we help folks to start to think about some evidence-based reasons why a particular problem is existing and and to focus on the versions of hypotheses that we're going to likely have the most control over and the most impact. And so there are different ways that we can look to do that. The document in the chat pod, I'm sorry, the download pod, helps give you some of those domains. And so as you think about a particular problem, now we can start thinking about the why statement behind that. We can focus on what's alterable, actionable, and then this issue of valid, we're going to talk about also here in a minute too. Um, we can find something that's certainly alterable. We can find something that's actionable. And when we look at our assumption about why a problem exists and we say to ourselves, all right, we have control over that, it's alterable, and we could definitely make some actions on it. We have the resources to do something about it. But if it's not valid, meaning it's not true, well, then what are we going to do? Why would we want to take that on? So we'll get to that here in a minute. These acronyms of ISIL or CARED, for example, if you're familiar with a lot of the trainings from our colleagues on the RTI project, and or who have familiarity with the GTIPS document that I referenced earlier, they provide that ISIL framework, which stands for Instruction, Curriculum, Environment, Learner. Four basic domains that a team might think about where the reasons for a problem exists. CARED is an acronym that we've built here in our PBIS project, and basically we're trying to do is to emphasize a little bit more detail than what ISIL was doing for us. But they're essentially addressing the same domains. So in that hypothesis domains handout, you can start to see where teams can make access and use of the experts at their table. But a tool like this could also help them to make some conversations and some decisions or assumptions when they don't have sufficient content expertise at the table. And that really is a big part of the fidelity around this step of the process. In order for problem analysis to work really well, it's going to depend on the level and access to your content experts. If you have a reading tier 2 case that you're looking at, certainly we want to have our reading expert at the table. If it's a behavior case, we want to have our behavior expert at the table. But whatever type of problem it is that you're addressing, let's try to make sure that the right team members are obviously at the table and that can help us to do that. Again, I've talked about the alterable and the valid. We'll get into more of that in a minute. But this idea of a watershed variable, or what's also in the literature called a keystone target, this is also something too that in this step you can start to consider. If we find that there are a lot of valid reasons why a particular student is not performing well in school, again, pick an academic or behavior case that you're familiar with, and we're saying there's really not one reason for that. There's multiple reasons for this. You know, some of those are home-based, some of those are classroom-based, some of them are interpersonal-based. Then what we want to think about then is how do we prioritize those? Because we can't take them all on at the same time. But what we can do is think about what's the one that if we address that first, it will have an immediate impact on all the others, or it will outweigh the influence that these other barriers are having. So that would be a decision that could be made here at this particular step of the process. And so again, ISIL, CARE, just showing you a crosswalk of how similar they are. And if you have the hypothesis domains handout in front of you, again, you can see the touch points across these different domains. At tier 2, There is going to be a tendency across teams, especially more novice teams, to really want to start with and perhaps spend all their time, if not the majority of time, on that learner domain.
Mhm.
They're going to want to get into characteristics about the student. They're going to want to talk about their brother or sister. They're going to want to talk about what's going on at home. This is probably the place where you will have to help them the most because while it's easy to talk about those characteristics, they may not always be alterable and they may not always even be relevant to the situation.
Right.
So we're not asking folks to not engage that domain. We definitely know that there are some characteristics to consider when it comes to the learner, but we don't want to spend the majority of our time on that when there are other domains that we have to think about.
Yeah, you could also flip around that discussion. So if you start with discussions about the learner and people are focused on that student's home life, et cetera, flip that around and look at what can you control that might help with some of those challenges that could very much be grounded in reality.
Mhm.
So if there are issues going on at home, well, what about the curriculum have you included for the student that would address some of the needs that they might have, such as emotional intelligence sorts of skills, dealing with anger or fear, those types of skills. So flip it around on stuff that the school can actually have an impact on.
Yep. All right. So, so Troy, you're saying I'd like to see that the student is included in the eco-factor listing in my own practice. I find the student themselves too often times be the most valuable resource in the problem-solving process. Easy to cut to the chase once they trust you. And I completely agree with you, Troy. I think, though, we have to be careful about age appropriateness. I will say, as a school psychologist who's practiced in the schools, I have come across kids who do know how to say the right things. And while they do know what to say that you want to hear, we have to sometimes look at triangulating what they say with other sources of information. So I like self-report from students. I value self-report from students, and I do think it's a great place to start, assuming the student has the capacity to speak for themselves. They're either of age or ability. So some students, perhaps because of a language disability or a second language barrier, that comes into play if we have the resources to access their ideas. But another piece too, again, is hearing their point of view. I want to triangulate that, particularly when it's self-report. Yeah, absolutely. A police detective background is going to help you a lot. Yes, I see the connection there. Now, for those of you who have been on a team, problem-solving team at the school level, where you find that the team cannot seem to let go of some of these unalterable factors. They just want to drill into the fact that, you know what, these are students who they're not behaving well, and what's common across all of them is that they come from homes where there's a single parent. And everybody just sort of perseverates on this idea that, well, there's no help at home, there's no role models at home, or they live in a bad neighborhood where they're exposed to inappropriate behaviors, and on and on and on. It can be frustrating as a facilitator to have to try to manage that. It can sort of get away from you if you're not careful, and it'll eat up the whole meeting time, and then now nothing's been accomplished, a whole meeting time's been lost, and we still haven't figured out what we're going to do. This is a way or a strategy that you can use to get through those moments. Rather than say to a person, you know what, that's not alterable, we can't look at that. That's going to shut somebody down. They're not going to participate in this process with you. They're going to put up a wall socially, and they're just going to disengage the process altogether. And we really can't afford to do that. We need everybody at the table to help with this process. So what we can do is we can validate their input. They say that they think the biggest problem is that there's nobody at home, there's just a single parent. What we can do is turn that into a prediction statement and say, all right, well, let's think about that. They come from a single parent home, so let's turn that around then. If the students came from a home where there were two parents, then they would behave better. And what that does is it psychologically just forces people to start thinking about the alterableness of that. Like, okay, so what's the implication here? Are we going to have a date night at the school where now single parents don't have to be single anymore? I mean, okay. And maybe it's relevant. Maybe they do all come from, in fact, a single parent home. However, we just, it's not feasible to take that on.
That's right.
So I have validated that hypothesis. I recognize that there may be some truth to it. Let's go ahead and keep fishing for more. Thank you for your input. Give me another, please. And then let's keep the team moving forward. So it just helped to keep that momentum, keep team members engaged, especially as they're new to this process and they just don't understand the challenges they're creating for themselves when they perseverate on those types of variables. It's not that they're trying to be obstructive, it's just this is a new process typically for them, but we can coach them through to think about these other domains for which you have that handout. And so here's a format where you can actually introduce this to your school teams. You can certainly take this and tailor it to your district's choice of words and language that you feel comfortable with. But generally, it's going to work like this. We'll start out with a hypothesis. No matter what the problem is, let's just assume it's because teachers are not recognizing students for engaging in classroom rules. So maybe the problem is, large numbers of kids are getting office discipline referrals for a particular infraction. But we're saying it's because teachers are not recognizing students for engaging in classroom rules. So now we can turn that into a prediction statement and get a sense of whether or not this is alterable. And so if we say if teachers did provide higher amounts of positive attention and rewards to students for engaging in those classroom rules, then students in those classrooms will follow the classroom rules more consistently, resulting in fewer referrals for disruption. At that point, we can say, you know what, that A sounds relevant, B is alterable, and C, I think that's something that we could certainly work on. Well, let's first make sure it's valid before we build a plan on that. And so we could ask ourselves then, the question is, well, have teachers in fact not been recognizing students for engaging in classroom rules? See, that's our assumption, but we could be right or wrong. And if we're wrong, we could end up putting in place a whole series of professional development and reminders and motivators to get teachers to do something for which they're probably already doing. And when you do that, it really kind of just upsets people. So we don't want to do that. But we want to turn it into an assessment question, and the feature of that or the function of that allows us then to start thinking about where would we find answers to that question. So if we assume or ask the question, teachers are not recognizing students for engaging in classroom rules, we could interview teachers. We could maybe conduct some focus groups with teachers and students. We could survey staff and students. We could look at written documents. If there's a process at the school in which they're documenting the recognition of students for following rules. We could do observations, just a sample of observations across classrooms. Any of these would be ways that we could test out this question. And let's assume that we find out that from student reports that the students themselves are reporting that they have been taught the classroom rules and that teachers of the targeted students that we're thinking about for Tier 2 were observed to use the reward system and recognize those students for following rules. So at this point, and maybe at least one of you could answer in the chat pod for me, do you think we have evidence to support our hypothesis at this point? Remember, our assumption was that teachers are not recognizing these students, the ones that we're thinking about for Tier 2, are not recognizing them for following classroom rules. You see the answers we found. Is our hypothesis valid? Yes or no? Might be a little bit of a delay. Okay, Wendy, so we don't have enough evidence yet. Lorraine saying no. Perfect. Exactly. And so, Wendy, I like the way you phrased that. I don't think we have enough evidence yet. On the one hand, as a team, you could come to consensus at this point and say, you know what? I think there's enough evidence to say this hypothesis is not true. Let's just move on to something else. Or as a team, you might decide, you know what? We have early indications that this hypothesis is not valid, but let's keep testing this out. Let's go get more information. And you certainly have that choice to do that. It's a team consensus. But we're trying to get to a point where we can at least as a team decide whether or not this is what we're going to run with or this is something we need to move on with. And that's what this process helps us to do without losing membership, without losing people's opinions or input, and keeping it structured and moving forward. Just to kind of play around with a little bit of this, we're going to ask you again to type into the chat pod. So here's a problem statement. Students have received several office referrals for truancy and tardiness and have high levels of internalizing symptoms because. So if you want, we can think about one idea related to curriculum that could account for the identified problem. So can anyone think of a curriculum reason in which this problem might be existing? Okay, so the first period class is very difficult, so the work could be frustrating or the demands could be overly taxing for them, and so perhaps they're, just avoiding the class. They're coming in late,
Yeah, the
you know.
curriculum doesn't support differentiation for students with differing skill levels.
Good. All right, let's think about maybe another one. How about in the area of instruction? And so I see some others are already talking about curriculum from before. Good. Core curriculum, not meeting the needs of the standards. Yeah. Assigned a class they're not interested in? Absolutely.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, personal preference is a big part in motivating student behavior.
It also could be a matter of cultural relevancy as well.
Cultural relevancy, the pace is too fast for the instruction. It's not differentiated, like Therese was saying as well, Andrea. Um, Classes beyond their zone of proximal learning. So again, that frustrational level is occurring here. So all of these are absolutely the kinds of hypotheses that we could start to consider and then think about how we're going to validate that. What about school environment? Are there any hypotheses within the domain of school environment? Schedule's too short. All right,
Good. That's
good. Yeah, peer relationships. All right, so again, it could be very a negative climate. Maybe there's lots of hostility and conflict or poor peer relations.
Or
Uh,
maybe it's a middle school, lots of boyfriend girlfriend issues going on.
yeah, hormones,
Getting late to class, depressed because they're breaking up,
lots of talking going on.
what it could be. There we go.
Yeah,
Yep.
absolutely, yeah. Lockers is an issue. Kids are having a hard time. Maybe the locker is all the way across the school grounds, and by the time they get there to change their books, they don't have enough time to get to class, so they're late. So any of these are really the kinds of things that we would just ask that as you're helping school teams to learn how to engage in this process, help them to maybe have a script to follow or a set of domains to already start to consider. And then they kind of go through these domains and start to brainstorm some of those options. All right. Student characteristics, I'm just going to throw it up myself here and just think about, for example, again, the cultural piece.
Mhm.
For some students, perhaps they just don't really see that, being late 2 minutes is such a big deal. That, in their customs and their cultures and their events and their family life, being late is just part of the game, it's just the way it is. And there's really no standard for having to be on time or early. But certainly those kinds of variables can play out when we think about student characteristics. All right, good. So again, we have the problem statement, several office referrals for truancy and tardiness. Let's say that it's because students lack positive relationships with their teachers. So if students had positive relationships with these teachers, then they would arrive to class on time. They would demonstrate fewer internalizing symptoms. The assessment question, do students in fact report having positive relationships? So that's an assumption, but is it really true? And we could look at certainly talking to the students, maybe surveying them, um, uh, doing interviews, etc. And let's just say that we find that only 20% of students surveyed reported that they felt there was an adult at the school that they could turn to if they had a serious problem. So only 20% of the entire school student population said that they felt there was an adult that they had a relationship with. So at that point, somebody in the chat pod, if you would, do we have evidence to support our hypothesis? Thank you. Yes, I agree. And when we start thinking about tier two, of course, we want to make it relevant to the group of students that are on our radar at this point. Do these students, in fact, report not having those positive relationships? We could have done a poll of the whole school and found that only 20% did, but does that 20% include our kids that we're looking at for tier two? That would be a piece we could drill into. So again, the whole idea here, folks, and maybe again, this is something that we're just belaboring a point that you're familiar with, but if you're new to this, the idea here is before we change student schedules, before we give them access to interventions that require extra personnel, extra materials, extra time, things that cost us resources, we want to make sure that we're dealing with a problem that actually exists. And the reason for it is the actual reason. Because if not, then we end up spinning our wheels, and what loses is really not so much the teachers or the students as much as the buy-in for using this process to solve problems. I think in many ways, when we don't see solutions happening to the problem, we assume the process doesn't work. When in fact, maybe it's just, well, we picked a reason why that isn't true. All right, so in the interest of time, we kind of have to move on. Moving into step 3, we've already had webinars provided in this series on intervention planning, so I'm going to just refer you to those. Here are the links for that. I do want to just give you a quick reminder about the options that you have here at Tier 2. When you find that there are students that need some help at Tier 2, we can right off the bat just give them a standard protocol option. That is just like a standard treatment where we know it's a social skills problem. Let's put them in a social skills group. We know that it's an anger issue with peers. Let's put them in an anger management class. We can just right out of the gate give them something. Check in, check out. Another good example of that. Sometimes, though, those standard protocols that are built for specific students of ages or race or ethnicity or situations need to be customized for a particular group that we're looking at. So there we want to get a little bit more information, a little bit more analysis to figure out how to customize it directly for that group. And then in some cases, maybe not as often at Tier 2, more often at Tier 3, we could engage in a completely customized intervention design where we really drill into analysis of the situation and all the variables involved. Here are some resources for you if you're interested in understanding more about what evidence-based interventions exist. I will refer you all to each of these websites that provide you with a variety of ideas and resources on what constitutes evidence-based interventions. And also here are some more slides. Again, for the interest of time, I'm just going to highlight these, but we're not going to drill into them. But if you're looking for pro-social skill ideas, if you're looking for academic behavior skill ideas, each of these are evidence-based and can provide you some standard protocol options at your school. As I scroll through this, though, I want to mention also here a district role that can be served. I've seen in some districts where a intervention matrix has been developed that is communicated to schools. It sort of serves as a menu of if this kind of a problem, these are your options. If this kind of a problem, these are your options. And it's narrow, but it's specific, and the options are evidence-based. And I think when a district does that, it again just kind of makes this process more efficient for schools and makes the decision making a little bit easier. I think we want to probably move on since we are out of time on that. But rounding this out now to step 4 of the process, the final step, we're going to evaluate whether or not our efforts have worked. Certainly recall, though, in problem solving, there are 3 aspects to our plan that we have built. We've built something to do for the students. We've built, hopefully, something to do for the interventionist, how to support them to engage in the fidelity of this. And our plan should have a measurement component. What are we measuring? How do we monitor fidelity? And what are the decisions we're going to make when we come back to the table and look at that data? And that's really what I want to talk to you now about decision rules. There's a handout in the file pod there for you called Decision Rules Crosswalk. This is a piece that I have yet to see really schools using, but there's a reason why we're encouraging you to do this. And here's the reason why. At some point, you've developed interventions, you've implemented those, you've collected progress monitoring data, and you've collected fidelity information about the intervention itself. And so when we put those 2 together, we have to make a decision. What are we going to do next? Is this a kid who now we need to give them more intervention intensity, or do we have to perhaps, they've progressed really well, we can fold them back to Tier 1 and remove Tier 2 supports, but how do we make that decision? Well, a couple of ways are to have these decision rules. If we have student outcomes that are positive and fidelity is strong, we'll continue that intervention. If the outcomes are low, progress monitoring is low, fidelity is low, well, I can't really make a statement about the intervention not working because we didn't do it the way we designed it. And then another option is our outcomes are poor, we're not getting what we want out of this, but we're using it the way we intended to. The fidelity is high. And in those situations, maybe we need to modify or completely change the intervention altogether. But when we have the combination of data, student progress and fidelity data, that's when we can make the most effective decisions. If we're only doing that with student data, we run the risk of making very poor decisions. And so that decisions rule crosswalk is a guide for you all to develop some of those decision rules. The district could do it yourself and have every school use a common one, and then the schools could tweak them. But certainly I hope that some of you will start thinking about how do we get schools to really build these decision rules a priori before we get our data from progress, so that then when we come together, we can make quick decisions. We don't have to spend hours of deliberation. All right. And so again, this is just some opportunities to practice that I think we'll have to skip in the interest of time. But it was a way for us to show you again how you can look at different sources of fidelity data for PBIS. Certainly looking at, for example, Tier 1 information, also looking at the TFI, the Tiered Fidelity Inventory, which is a tool available on our website, excuse me. And then just, again, finally, here are some additional resources for you to consider as you think about evaluating the overall health and success of your Tier 2. On this slide, I just want to remind you all again, the purpose of Tier 2 is to prevent kids from needing more intensive services. And if we find the majority of kids who get Tier 2 end up also getting and needing Tier 3, then we really do have to ask questions about whether Tier 2 is effective or not, because clearly not. It should be effective for the majority of kids who gain access to it and not have to have more intensive services. So thank you all again so very much for your participation today. Next month's webinar chat will be about disproportionality, and then we'll also have another one on Tier 2 series regarding the secondary setting. I apologize, we've run out of time. However, we will stick around. If you have questions or comments, please give them to us in the chat pod. Also, if there's anything that you like that you heard about today, please share that with others on Facebook or on Twitter using our accounts. And with that, have a fantastic day to you all.